We know Chicago as a city of big shoulders, but we don't always think of Chicago as a city of big protests and considerable police violence in response. From the Haymarket Rebellion through the 1937 Republic Steel Strike to Martin Luther King's demonstrations in Marquette Park up to contemporary times where there are protests against police violence. Today, Dr. Rachel Boyle joins me in examining public history and dissent in the city of Chicago. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Rachel Boyle, to discuss conflict in Chicago. Welcome, Dr. Boyle. Dr. Boyle got her Ph.D. in public history from Loyola University, worked for Newberry Library, the Minnesota Historical Society, and then recently formed an organization, Omnia History. Is that correct?
Yes, yep, Omnia History.
One of the reasons that you say Omnia exists for is to be able to learn from history to prepare for social change in the present.
Yes.
Maybe you could explain to us what a public historian does, and then how you in particular as a public historian sees that this could inform social change.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the most capacious definition of public history would be really anywhere that the public encounters history. So that could be, historical societies, museums, monuments, family histories, oral histories, is kind of the big tent of public history, wherever the public encounters the past and engages with the past.
So this would exclude books, like books of history. Those would be excluded. We're talking mostly displays of photographs and icons and...
That depends. The line between what we call public history and perhaps like academic history it's not a firm line, but oftentimes what academic historians are producing are manuscripts that are oftentimes not necessarily directed primarily toward the public, but are directed toward each other, contributing to a broader scholarly conversation. So that would probably be, if we think of academic history and public history on a spectrum, a traditional manuscript, scholarly manuscript would be on the academic side. A kind of a popular history book would be hanging out somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, but ways that the public maybe more informally encounters and engages with the past that maybe isn't in direct conversation with academic history would be in the public history realm.
So if someone did a history of the Republic Steel Strike in Chicago in 1937 and talked about the police violence and the organization of the USWA, the steelworkers, and what happened, that would be the academic. The public history would be photographs of the event, maybe newspaper. I mean, is it more display, so it's in accessible pieces so that the public gets it? Is that?
Yeah, I would say it's public engagement. So it'd be asking who's the audience for that history of the Republic Steel Strike, and who is the public that's engaging with this history? What are they bringing to the table in terms of knowledge of that particular event, and then where can the historian meet the public in terms of learning something new or connecting that past directly to the present and to the public's immediate needs.
So as a public historian, your task is to take chunks of history and present them in understandable, attractive, persuasive forms?
I would say it's actually engaging with the public. So rather than kind of a unidirectional, sharing of history, the public, broadly writ, so defined as just non-academics, already know history, already bring some kind of knowledge about the past. And so as a public historian, I think it's my role to work with the public to talk about the past, to think about ways that the past is applicable to the present and to present day needs. So it's kind of this idea of shared authority, and I bring a certain kind of academic authority, but the public brings an authority about the past as well.
I appreciate that things should be participatory, that we can't just inform what we know as researchers or even historians.
Right.
But I would question whether or not the public actually has any historical knowledge of some of the things that were in your recent display Chicago protest. I mean, I'm not sure how many the average citizen in Chicago cannot find Haymarket Square, I would venture. And to say that there were police shootings at Republic Steel in 1937. So when you say this interaction, it seems like it's at the beginning of it is certainly presenting this, and then the response may be the interaction. But what do they bring? I mean, I'm not sure if any of that's taught in the public schools, for instance.
That's a great question. Yeah, so certainly I would like to think that, as a historian, I could bring, certain stories about the past that are maybe have been kind of intentionally silenced or marginalized. That said, I do think that there is a public interest and understanding in protest right now, in the role of police in protest, in police violence, in the negotiation of public space and the expression of ideas in public space. And there is certainly a historical knowledge about that, depending on which communities we're talking about. And so that's kind of the access point then to bring in more historical context to the conversation about whether it be protest or police violence.
Well, again, I would question how much the public, or if we're talking about social movements within the public, actually have a historical context in which to respond to this. So one of the things also was the Laquan McDonald, the killing by the police, and then the protests. And I would suggest that the majority of people are protesting, but they have no recognition or understanding or did not draw lessons from the Marquette Park March by King or the 68 Democratic Party Convention or the Civil Rights Movement per se, because it's almost like each response, each protest kind of starts anew. The history is understood by the police, the mayor's office, the Democratic Party, but I'm not sure that it's understood by the people that were actually in the protests at Laquan McDonald, where they said, we know the history of the Chicago police, we know the history of the Chicago Democratic Party, we know what we had. I mean, I'm not sure, I mean, that's why I see what you do as absolutely essential to fill in those vacancies in our collective knowledge.
That's really interesting, because in my perspective, I certainly can't speak on behalf of all protesters, because even with historical protests and contemporary protests is not one monolithic group. That said, my very limited experience is that oftentimes protesters are very aware of the history of police violence in Chicago, and I view a lot.
How much history though? The history of recent or since Ferguson. I mean, if you're 20 years old or 23 years old, how much history of police violence do you know? Do you actually know that Republic Steel happened, or that they shot, Fred Hampton in his bed? I just wonder.
Yeah, I wonder too. I do suspect though that within activist communities in Chicago there is a very deep and knowledgeable understanding of that past. And oftentimes I find that the work that I'm doing around protest is often directed. When I think about who's the audience that I'm writing for, it isn't necessarily even, for example, if we're talking about activists in Chicago, because I think activists in Chicago do know that history. I'm looking for folks who are maybe watching the protest on TV and don't understand this very deep history of distrust between protesters and police in the city. And so I actually view a lot of my work as giving kind of that historical context to folks who maybe aren't as engaged in the protests but are watching them from afar.
Right, that's where I thought that what you're doing is so essential, because from my perspective is there isn't a lot of historical memory there, that the public historian has a responsibility, almost an ethical obligation, to present what's missing. Not necessarily to predetermine how you're going to evaluate it, but present things in to the lack of a better word, more objective, more balanced perspective on historical events, so that the larger public can make draw some of their own conclusions. One of the things that Omnia, and maybe you could talk a little bit about why Omnia History exists and what you intend to do with it, but one of the things is that it's described as a collaborative project dedicated to using the past to promote social change in the present. So again, this kind of bumps up against my question before. If the past is something that the public gets to write, not just the public historian, how does that inform or lead to social change in the present or future?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so Omnia History, yeah, as you said, it's a public history collaborative, and a lot of what we're doing is working with small cultural organizations like historical societies, small museums, and other groups who our goal in kind of the promoting social change aspect is to come to the table with our publics. And in the Omnia perspective, our publics would be these cultural organizations, because a lot of times we're talking about totally volunteer-run organizations.
So are you talking like cultural organizations like, say, the Puerto Rican community or the Mexican-American community in Chicago and their cultural institutions? Would that be the kind of interface that Omnia would seek out? Or is it primarily museums of any size?
I would say, well, yes to all of the above, but I would say our primary audience at the moment would be historical societies and small museums and other cultural organizations like you're talking about. Primarily, organizations that are, again, largely volunteer-run or very much representative of a very local public, and are very much invested in certain kinds of histories and certain kinds of pasts, and basically coming to the table with cultural organizations and having that exchange to figure out, what is important to you about the past, or in what ways are you applying the past to the present. And then our role as public historian is to kind of either bring in stories that maybe need to be included.
That were not there before?
Exactly, yeah. Or maybe it's to provide more depth or to provide support to cultural organizations. But really the goal is, that social change part is making sure that that historians are at the table with the public, as opposed to, again, like we were talking about before, that kind of unidirectional transfer of information, which isn't necessarily identifying who the audience is. It's not engaging with the public. So that's really what we're trying to do in terms that we think we can move forward if we at least come to the table, figure out where we are, and then we can use history in a more directed, meaningful way.
Okay, to use it for questions of social change. My son worked at a museum in New Hampshire, and he was an archivist. Okay. And he uncovered all of this material that the museum held that talked about the history of slavery in New Hampshire, which is not something that appeared in the museum's presentation. And there was a real pushback of, why would you want to do this? So what role does the historian or a public historian have to present things that are part of history but are not apparent, and there may even be a resistance by the public? Why would Ukrainian Village want to know about the racism of Ukrainian Village for blacks moving into this part? Why would we want to do that when we're here to celebrate our Ukrainian, not to pick on the Ukrainians, that was just an example.
Yeah.
So do you bump up against that, and then what is your role, or what is the role of a public historian to raise these very difficult and is it, I guess on another level, would it even be necessary? What is the benefit of doing something like that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that's absolutely the role of the public historian, is to, to push for stories that need to be told within the broader context of the setting. So the example of slavery in New Hampshire is a perfect example, because I think the historian really has an ethical obligation to ensure that is part of the story, because you can't talk about. For example, I've worked with historical societies anywhere in the current U.S. are often on indigenous land. And so you really can't tell the story about white settlers, for example, without talking about the land being the home of indigenous people, both past and present. So you really can't talk about any history in what is currently the United States without that indigenous history being part of that up into the present day. And so, yeah, I absolutely think that's the role of the historian, to bring that to the table. The question of resistance is interesting, because that one often does encounter resistance. And I think that's a delicate thing, because I think there's a time for the historian to push, but I also think that if an organization is not willing, particularly when we're talking about small historical societies, museums, if they're not willing to engage with these stories, which are oftentimes being requested and demanded by the public, their financial stability, they will continue to be less relevant to their publics, and that will affect their financial stability, and they will die. However, I think if these organizations are engaging with these stories that are like Indigenous history or the histories of slavery. I think that that is a way for organizations to be more relevant to their publics and to be telling fuller stories about how they're there, why we're here, what our stories are.
Well, I guess this is a philosophical question, which is partly history, but if you have a whole group of people that are in favor of cultural diversity and gender equality and equal access to media or education, and that's what they do. That is their persona. That is their political stance. And they believe they've been this way forever. And you go back and find out, nope, 200 years ago you weren't this way, you were something else. Yep. How does that help them to understand what they're doing now, as opposed to kind of discredit? I mean, it's often you can easily discredit somebody for something that they said either intentionally or unintentionally, but when we're talking about whole communities or whole sections, I mean, I think about Thanksgiving. Is it, by its nature, it's a racist phenomena, imposition on indigenous people in the United States. On the other hand, if you have a whole group of second and third graders that think they should be kind to Native Americans and share their bounty, is that, I'm not sure how I can balance those, because if what we know is not true, but if what we know is useful, how is it improved by what we know that is, might find out that is true, that challenges the usefulness of what we do? Is that too convoluted?
You know, I think this comes, it's a little convoluted, but it's, I think this comes back to, if we're talking about our publics and our audiences, and we're talking about an organization and we have found some kind of harm that that organization has done in the past, I think we need to ask who did that harm and bring those folks into the conversation to try to come up with that answer of what do we do now. And so, for example, Thanksgiving is a great example. If we're talking about, you know, we need to be having conversations with indigenous groups to talk about what the future of Thanksgiving should be. And so I think that would be the same with that hypothetical organization. Who was harmed in that history, and then that becomes a really critical stakeholder in the conversations about how to use that history for contemporary reconciliation or reparations or justice or whatever that organization's mission is.
Yeah, I just, it's always difficult for me, because someone could even be in favor of reparations, but then you question their sincerity because 100 years ago they had a settler that moved onto indigenous land, which doesn't mean that their support of reparations is questioned now, but it is easily questioned now because they're suspect, because they have a historical tradition that isn't, you know, speaking with forked tongue, so to speak. So.
I think there's a lot of space, you know, in the public history world. I think the value of the public history field is where we can grapple with that and the complexities, and you know, it's not the simple narratives that have so long been propagated by museums in particular and historical societies haven't need to be more complicated, and there needs to be space for those complexities and those paradoxes.
One
Absolutely.
thing you said earlier that maybe we can address quickly is you suggested that they cease to exist if they don't meet the needs of their public. On the other hand, it seems in our current times, museums exist because they become commodities for so-called philanthropists that will fund museums or exhibits based upon their interest, and will withdraw money if it bumps up against their own political persuasions. So I'm not sure how much the public has when it's all based upon admission or contribution or underwriting.
Absolutely. I actually completely agree, and have actually been joining folks in exploring what public history cooperatives could look like to really fundamentally change the funding models of these organizations so that the mission and the funding and the programs and interpretation are all rooted within an organization's public. So instead of looking to the public for engagement, but the funder for the actual content, what if organizations are looking to their publics for funding and content? And I think that fundamentally changes the relationship between an organization and its public.
It may even allow for the public to contribute to the museum, because I mean, where do you get your information, like oral histories letters,
Exactly.
photographs. I mean, it largely could come from the public in many instances. So.
Exactly, and that's a perfect example right there of public history, right? So that's the public coming to the table and being equal partners in the production of history.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a larger question that has
Yeah.
to do with your place of protest exhibition, which was recently in Chicago, right? I don't know if it's still, is it still ongoing?
It's a digital exhibit on behalf of the Chicago Collections Consortium, and it is available online.
And you would look up
Yep, Place of Protest.
place of protest.
Yep, Chicago Collections, and it'll show up on Google.
Okay, I've seen some of those, and my question is, again, a broad question. I hope it's not too broad, but one of the things you say, we learn from the past to promote social change. So several of the things in your collection struck me. One was, I keep referring to the Republic Steel Strike of '37 and the police killing of protesters. Kings led the march in Marquette, and there was violence against the protesters. The Haymarket affair, which was largely a peaceful event, but at the end it ended in, I would argue, police violence, all the way through Laquan McDonald. So are there lessons, because you're saying there's lessons from these, would you say individually, or would there be lessons that you could draw collectively about the role of protest and the resistance by forces of control, for the lack of a better word, in Chicago?
Yes.
Yes, okay, that's the answer.
That's the
Okay,
answer, yep.
moving on. What might be one or two of those?
Well, I think, since we've brought it up a couple times, I do think the long history of antagonism between police and protesters in Chicago is really important. Yeah, I mean, so you brought up Haymarket, and even prior to that, one of the protests that's covered in the exhibit is the Lager Beer Riot. And in many of these examples, leading all the way up, as you mentioned, into the present, oftentimes police are employed either on behalf of the city, or perhaps are sent to protect property of industrialists.
But it's always presented as protecting property per se. I mean, private property, as if it's mine and yours. Not Republic Steel, but it's, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yes.
But their function is, the lesson of the function of the police through these decades would be?
I think the lesson is that, when a protest takes place today, and there are protesters and police, that is not just a moment in a vacuum, that we are talking about a police force that does have a very long history of collective violence, of violence when it comes to protest. And we are talking about spaces in the city and groups in the city who are also coming to that space expecting police violence as well, based on that long history. And so I think, I think that is just the lesson, to acknowledge that there is kind of a long cultural legacy and a lot of cultural baggage coming to a specific moment in a specific space. Yeah.
It has a lot to do with how we understand crime, and we don't have a lot of time. Maybe you can come back to talk later, but I know your dissertation was on depictions of crime and gender, so maybe you could speak to that briefly.
Yeah, so I study, so my research focuses on the criminalization of women in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century, so 1870 to 1920 about. And something that is very clear when studying these women is, first of all, that criminality is a construct. Who is the aggressor against the law and who isn't is something that changes over time. It is not fixed, and it is oftentimes applied differently based on race or gender or class.
Right, a man is assertive and a woman is aggressive and maybe even a little bit
hysterical.
Yeah.
A woman would be, the women that I study are often, if they're white middle class women, they are oftentimes determined to be hysterical and therefore not culpable for their crime. However, oftentimes many working class women, many black women, maybe black working class women that I study, are oftentimes viewed as just inherently criminal, or their behavior, their activities to try to make a living in the city are designated as vice. And therefore, they are considered criminal in and of themselves as an inherent trait, as opposed to they couldn't even possibly be held culpable for a crime in the case of middle-class white women. So yeah, absolutely, that's a good example of how who is considered criminal and who isn't really.
And who
depends on
gets
the
to
time and
define
space.
that, which again comes back to the role of a public historian, because it's often defined by not us or not the community that even appears at a museum, but someone else that has the power to make those constructs about crime, or is protest reasonable or is it emotional?
Right.
So-
Is it a riot, or is it a
yeah,
is it a
or is
peaceful
it a
protest?
rebellion, or is it a protest? Yes.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. The language that we use really brings its cultural baggage and determines how an event and how people are not only treated or perceived, but also like the very real consequences they face by the city or the state, whether they're incarcerated or they are attacked by police or not.
Well, the reach of your place of protest, the Chicago Legacy of Dissent, was wide. I looked at several. It's on a chronology. If anybody goes online, you can see it on the chronology. The Haymarket riot, the Marquette Park demonstration, all the way through Laquan McDonald and a recent protest. So we would have to have a longer conversation,
Yes.
which we don't have time to
Yeah.
now. I'm sorry, but thank you for coming, because that's all the time we have
All
on our
right.
program
Thank you.
today. Thank you, Dr. Rachel Boyle, for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.